Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really honored to be here. And yeah, my name is Xiye Bastida. I'm an 18-year-old climate justice activist, and I was one of the Fridays for Future organizers in New York City before the pandemic. And currently, I work with Re-Earth Initiative, which I co-founded just a year ago, right when the pandemic began. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of my background and then some of my tips of how to, get people to act in when it comes to the climate crisis. So I was born and raised in Mexico in a small town called San Pedro Tultepec, and um, you know, in my town, my dad is part of the Otomi Toltec indigenous community. So I grew up with this philosophy, indigenous philosophy of reciprocity and love with Mother Earth. And when I started growing up and saw that relationship be disrespected by extractivist industries, I realized that there was a disconnect between the values that I had growing up and what was actually happening. I couldn't believe that people were profiting off of destruction, pollution, and other things that were harming us as people and our environment. Um, but still, all of the talk around global warming and climate change was that it was going to happen in 50 or 100 years. So that's not really something that was in my mind as to why we were in the current state that we were. But in 2015, my hometown suffered from flooding. So then I realized that, the climate crisis is not only already happening now, already affecting communities, but it's also affecting those communities that have the least resources to come back from these disasters. And these communities are not only being affected by they're not only being affected by the result of the climate crisis, but also by all the infrastructure that's actually perpetuating it. So that's when environmental racism comes in, and that's where climate justice comes in, because we have to realize how all of these things interconnect. um, and after that, I moved to New York City, and I was one of those teenagers who was like, I need to do something about this, but I didn't know where to start. And I think that a lot of us find ourselves in that situation, but just having that first impulse is what you have to hold on to. So I decided to join my school's environmental club. And I joined like towards the end of the year, and we were focusing on recycling initiatives in the school and having challenges for the whole school of how to be vegan for a day or things like that. But I knew that we could have a stronger impact, because coming from Mexico, I always saw New York City as this beacon of inspiration and kind of saw the power that it had to influence other places around the world. So I knew that New York City was such a special place to raise your voice, because it's kind of a global stage. So I decided to, when I became leader of the environmental club the next year, to organize all of the students to go up to Albany to lobby for the CLCPA, the Climate and Leadership Community Protections Act. We also went to City Hall several times to testify for the need of the climate emergency and other important legislation. And doing all of this, I realized that a lot of the times people in government will listen to you, but there's not enough incentive to move forward because there's no pressure to go forward. And that's when I decided that I needed to start striking. And I organized my high school, Beacon High School, to strike for the first ever global climate strike on March 15th. And we got 600 of the students to go out, which is amazing. And that grew exponentially up until September 2019, where we got 300,000 people to strike all over New York City and over 7 million all over the world. And I tell you this story because it shows that it's not only about New York City being the catalyst for change and a global stage, but it's also about us as individuals, how we can act as initiators of change. And a lot of the times you won't be given a space at the table. You have to build your own tables. You have to just ask yourself, how can I help? How can I use my skills and do it through a climate lens to further the movement? And now I'm going to share with you 5 or 6 of the reasons why I think people are not acting on climate. The first one is psychological distance. The messaging has been for too long that the climate crisis will happen by 2100. So it is our duty to communicate that clearly and say it's already happening. We're not doing this for future generations. We're also doing it for present generations and for present communities that are being affected. The next one is finite pool of worry. And I think this is where environmental justice and a just transition comes in, because people have different needs, putting food at the table, paying rent, especially with COVID-19. It has become really hard to meet all of those needs because of layoffs and evictions. So we need to make sure that our solutions are intersectional in that regard, that they focus on furthering social justice, because climate justice is social justice. When you have a just transition to a renewable economy, you can train people to go to that sector, but you have to do it in a way that actually makes sense, not just making people switch their entire profession that they've pursued their entire life or maybe for generations. So we have to be really conscious about how we engage in that transition. The next point is emotional numbing, and this is where climate anxiety comes in. There's a lot of facts that are daunting when it comes to the climate crisis. So this is why we have to pair every single one of our statements with solutions. Because this is the biggest crisis that we've ever faced, but it's also our biggest opportunity to come together, to have holistic solutions, to, incite change in a way that brings us all together. And that's something that's really important, because if not, we're just going to get stuck. And I think a lot of people think that the climate crisis is not at the top of everyone's minds, but if it was one of the leading issues in the presidential race, like that means millions of people are thinking about it across the US and many more millions across the world. The next one is confirmation bias. A lot of the times we tend to agree with information that suits our own perspective of the world. And it's important to realize that this is something that we've never seen before. So we need to open our minds to not only how the problem is being perpetuated, but also the new solutions. And the last one is discounting. I'd rather lose $100 in 10 years than lose $100 now. And we have to realize that the price that we're going to pay for the climate crisis is actually a lot more than the price we would pay to avert it. And that not only comes in economic terms, but also in emotional terms. Like, I want my kids to be happy. We're ultimately doing this for joy, for the preservation of stability, security, peace, because the climate crisis is, at the end of the day, very violent, and the perpetuators are violent, and it's our job to counter that with positive action, stubborn optimism, and keep moving forward. So I think I'm nearing the end of my time, but I also have 10 tips of how to be a climate activist. If you want to check them out, you can message me or something, because I don't have time to share them with you today. But my final message is that we don't need 100 people to do climate justice activism perfectly. We need millions of people doing their best. And that includes all of us. And that includes doing your specific skills the best you can, through a climate lens, because at the end of the day, this is something that we're all sharing, and we're all gonna be part of the movement sooner or later. So thank you all for being here and for listening to me.